the invisible man of Ridgemont High. I used to be the kid people looked through, not at. Then I bought the school. Daniel Chen had perfected the art of being invisible. Not literally, of course, though sometimes he wondered if that might have been easier. No, Daniel's invisibility was the social kind, the type that came from being aggressively unremarkable in a high school that worshipped at the altar of athletic prowess, social media followers, and the kind of effortless charisma he'd never possessed. He sat in the back corner of Mr. Patterson's calculus class, the same seat he'd occupied for 3 years running, watching the usual suspects hold court. There was Brandon Mitchell, quarterback and walking cliché, holding forth about his scholarship offers while his girlfriend Madison scrolled through her phone with practiced disinterest. There was Derek Chen, no relation, thank God, cracking jokes that weren't particularly funny but earned laughs anyway because he'd somehow accumulated enough social capital to make even his silences seem purposeful. Daniel took notes. He always took notes, filling notebook after notebook with precise handwriting that his teachers praised but his classmates never asked to borrow. Why would they? He was a ghost, a placeholder, the human equivalent of beige wallpaper. Mr. Chen, Mr. Patterson's voice cut through his observations. Can you solve the equation on the board? Daniel glanced up. It was a relatively simple differential equation, the kind that would stump most of the class but presented no real challenge if you understood the fundamentals. He stood, walked to the board, and methodically worked through the solution, while the class returned to their whispered conversations and surreptitious phone checking. Excellent work, Mr. Patterson said as Daniel returned to his seat. A few people glanced his way, not at him exactly, but in his general direction, before returning to whatever they'd been doing. Invisible. This had been Daniel's existence for the better part of 4 years. He'd entered Ridgemont High as a skinny freshman with second-hand clothes and an unfortunate haircut his mother had insisted on giving him to save money. He'd leave it in 6 months as a skinny senior with slightly better clothes and a haircut from an actual barber, but fundamentally unchanged in the eyes of his peers. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know because they'd never bothered to ask, was that Daniel had been building something. It had started innocuously enough in his sophomore year. Unable to afford the ridiculously overpriced study guides everyone else used for AP exams, Daniel had created his own. He'd compiled notes, written explanations that actually made sense, and formatted everything in a clean, accessible way. Then, on a whim, he'd uploaded them to a website he'd built himself over a weekend. He hadn't expected anything to come of it. Maybe a few downloads from other broke students looking for free resources. Instead, within a month, he had 10,000 users. Within 3 months, 50,000. The feedback was overwhelming. Students loved that his explanations were clear without being condescending, comprehensive without being overwhelming. So he'd made more guides: AP Chemistry, AP Biology, SAT Prep, ACT Prep, each one better than the last, refined based on user feedback and his own relentless perfectionism. Then came the pivot that changed everything. Junior year, during a particularly frustrating group project where he'd ended up doing 90% of the work while his partners took 90% of the credit, Daniel had a realization. Students didn't just need study materials. They needed project management tools designed for actual students, not watered-down versions of corporate software. He'd spent 3 months building StudySync, a platform that combined study resources with collaboration tools, deadline tracking, and a clean interface that didn't look like it was designed in 2003. He'd launched it with 0 expectations and $100 in Google Ads he'd saved from his weekend job at the library. The first month he had 1,000 users. The second month, 10,000. By the end of junior year, StudySync had 200,000 active users across 40 states. Daniel had monetized carefully, keeping a free tier robust enough that no student would be left behind while offering premium features that schools and tutoring centers were willing to pay for. He taught himself business law, negotiated his first B2B contracts, and set up an LLC while his classmates were stressing about prom dates. The money had started as a trickle, then a stream, then a flood. By the start of senior year, Daniel was pulling in $30,000 a month in revenue. By October, it was $50,000. By January, he'd cracked 6 figures monthly, and a venture capital firm from Silicon Valley had approached him with an acquisition offer. $7 million for a company he'd built in his bedroom, while being systematically ignored by everyone around him. He'd taken the meeting via Zoom, wearing the same hoodie he wore to school, answering questions from investors who assumed they were talking to a college student, maybe a grad student, certainly not a high school senior who still needed permission slips for field trips. Daniel had turned down the $7 million, not out of pride or attachment, but because he'd run the numbers and knew StudySync was worth at least 3 times that. He'd countered at $18 million, and after 2 weeks of negotiation, they'd settled at $22 million, with Daniel retaining a 15% equity stake and a position as a consultant. The deal had closed 2 weeks ago. The money, minus taxes, minus what he'd set aside for college, minus the chunk he'd put in investments, sat in his bank account like a secret too large to keep but too strange to share. But Daniel had kept it secret anyway, because who would he tell? His mother, who worked double shifts at the hospital and already cried every time he bought groceries without asking for money. His classmates, who wouldn't believe him anyway. His teachers, who saw him as a good student but nothing exceptional. So he'd stayed invisible, watching and waiting for something, he wasn't sure what. That something arrived on a Tuesday in March, during lunch period. Daniel sat at his usual table, not the outcast table exactly, but the table for people who weren't quite anything. There was Jeremy, who spent lunch periods writing fantasy novels on his laptop. Priya, who was brilliant and knew it and had no patience for social games. And Marcus, who transferred in junior year and never quite cracked the social hierarchy. "Did you guys hear?" Priya looked up from her phone, eyes wide. "The school district is broke. Like, actually broke. They're talking about cutting all the arts programs, canceling the spring sports season, and laying off half the teachers." Daniel had heard. He'd actually read the full school board meeting minutes, because that was the kind of thing he did while other people watched TikToks. "That's insane," Marcus said. "My sister's on the softball team. They're actually good this year." "Doesn't matter if there's no money," Jeremy said without looking up from his screen. "My dad said the district's been mismanaging funds for years. This was inevitable." The conversation drifted to other topics, but Daniel kept thinking about it. Ridgemont High, despite ignoring him personally, had given him something valuable. Mr. Patterson, who'd encouraged his analytical thinking. Ms. Rodriguez, who'd let him use the library's computers after hours when he was building his first website. Even Principal Morrison, who'd approved his independent study in computer science when it wasn't technically in the curriculum. That afternoon, Daniel skipped his last period, AP Literature, where he was invisible enough that his absence likely wouldn't be noted, and walked to the district office building downtown. The superintendent's secretary looked surprised when he asked for a meeting. "Dr. Williams is very busy," she said with the practiced politeness of someone used to dismissing people. "If this is about graduation requirements." "It's about the budget crisis," Daniel said. "I have a proposal." Something in his tone must have intrigued her because she picked up the phone. "Let me see if she has 15 minutes. Dr. Williams was a tired-looking woman in her 50s, with the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting bureaucratic battles she kept losing. She gestured for Daniel to sit, clearly expecting this to be another student complaint or parent tantrum. "Mr. Chen, right? I recognize you from the honor roll assemblies. What can I do for you? I want to make a donation to the district, Daniel said. $2 million, specifically earmarked for programs that are about to be cut, with oversight to ensure the funds are used appropriately. Dr. Williams blinked, then blinked again. I'm sorry, did you say? $2 million. I can have my lawyer send over the paperwork by end of week. I'll need some things in return: transparency about how it's spent, a seat on the advisory committee, and a guarantee that no teachers will be laid off due to budget issues this year. Mr. Chen, Dr. Williams leaned forward. I don't mean to be rude, but is this some kind of joke? Daniel pulled out his phone and showed her his bank statement. Her eyes went very wide. How does a high school student have? I built a company, sold it, and I'd like to give back to a school that, despite certain social shortcomings, provided me with an education and teachers who cared. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, Dr. Williams had called the district's lawyer, verified that yes, this was legal and possible, and looked at Daniel like he'd sprouted wings. Why, she finally asked, why do this? You could do anything with that money. Daniel thought about being invisible, about walking through hallways where no one saw him, about 3 years of eating lunch at the quiet table, of group projects where he was the last pick, of understanding that he simply didn't register as important to the people around him. Because what if the next invisible kid is sitting in Mr. Patterson's calculus class right now, learning the foundations they'll need to build something amazing? And what if they can't, because we cut the programs that kept them engaged or fired the teachers who actually gave a damn? He shrugged. I'm not doing this for recognition. I'm doing it because it's right. The press release went out on Friday. By Monday morning, Ridgemont High was in chaos. Daniel arrived at school to find news vans in the parking lot, reporters trying to interview students, and a general atmosphere of carnival-like bewilderment. He kept his head down, hoodie up, and tried to slip into the building unnoticed. He made it approximately 15 feet before Principal Morrison intercepted him. Mr. Chen, Daniel, could you please come to my office? The walk through the hallways was surreal. Students who'd looked through him for years now turned to stare. Whispers followed in his wake. Was that him? The guy who gave the school $2 million? No way, that can't be him. He's nobody. Morrison's office was packed. Dr. Williams was there, along with several school board members, 2 lawyers, and Mr. Patterson, who caught Daniel's eye and gave him a small, knowing smile. Daniel, Morrison began, clearly unsure how to address someone who was simultaneously a student under her authority and a major benefactor. We wanted to thank you personally, and also to discuss the logistics of. A commotion outside interrupted her. Through the glass wall of the office, Daniel could see a crowd forming, students, a lot of students. Madison Kim appeared at the door, Brandon Mitchell hovering behind her. Principal Morrison, sorry to interrupt, but everyone's talking about Daniel Chen, and we were wondering if we could, say something. Morrison looked at Daniel, who shrugged, sure. Madison stepped forward, and for the first time in 4 years of attending the same school, she looked directly at Daniel. Actually looked at him, like he was a person who existed in 3-dimensional space. So apparently you saved our school, the art program, and you have millions of dollars. Her voice lilted up at the end, making even statements sound like questions. That's insane. Why didn't you tell anyone? Would you have listened? Daniel asked, not unkindly. The silence was deafening. Brandon cleared his throat. Dude, look, I'm not gonna lie, I don't think I've ever actually talked to you. Not once in 4 years. That's messed up. Very messed up. Priya appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. Some of us talked to him. Some of us were actually his friends. Not that anyone ever noticed. More students crowded around. Derek Chen, no relation, pushed forward. Man, I thought we were the successful Chen. Guess I need to reevaluate. It was meant as a joke, but it fell flat. The questions came rapid fire after that. What company did you build? How did you make so much money? Why are you still here? Are you going to college? Can you help me with my startup idea? Daniel held up his hands. I'm still just me. I built some software that helped students study. It grew bigger than I expected. I sold it. And I gave money to the school because education matters and the teachers here matter, even if I spent most of my time being invisible. You weren't invisible, Mr. Patterson interjected quietly. We saw you, Daniel, some of us anyway. Morrison regained control of the room. All right, everyone back to class. Mr. Chen will be making a brief statement at an assembly tomorrow. Until then, please respect his privacy. The crowd dispersed reluctantly. Madison lingered, looking uncomfortable. Hey, Daniel, I know this is weird, but a bunch of us were thinking. We're having a party this weekend. Kind of a celebration that the spring season is saved. Would you want to come? 4 years. 4 years of being overlooked, of being the backup option, of being nothing. And now, suddenly, an invitation. Daniel could have been petty. Part of him wanted to be. But he looked at Madison, really looked at her, and saw not a popular girl deigning to notice him, but a 17-year-old kid who'd spent her high school career performing popularity instead of building substance, and who was now confronted with the uncomfortable reality that she'd missed something important because she'd been looking in all the wrong places. Thanks, he said, but I've got plans with my actual friends. You know, the people who saw me before I had money. He said it without malice, but Madison flinched anyway. That weekend, Daniel didn't go to any parties. Instead, he took Jeremy, Priya, and Marcus to the nicest restaurant in town, his treat, and they celebrated together. Not his success exactly, but the fact that they'd all survived high school by building their own quiet corner of authenticity in a place that rewarded performance. So what now? Jeremy asked over dessert. You're set for life, you could do anything. Daniel had been thinking about that. I'm going to MIT, already got an early admission. Gonna study computer science, maybe some business classes, build the next thing. Another app, Marcus asked. Maybe, or maybe something bigger. I learned something from being invisible all these years. Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. People ignore what they don't understand, and they don't understand what they don't see. I want to build things that force people to see, really see, what's actually valuable. Not what's popular or flashy, but what actually matters. Priya raised her glass of sparkling cider, to seeing what matters. They clinked glasses, 4 invisible kids who'd found each other in the margins and built something real. The assembly on Monday was standing room only. Daniel stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces that were, for once, actually looking back at him, seeing him. He kept his remarks brief. He thanked the teachers who'd supported him. He explained that success came from consistency, from solving real problems, from building things that helped people. He didn't mention the years of loneliness or the sting of being overlooked. That would have been petty, and Daniel had learned something more important than pettiness. He'd learned that the best revenge wasn't making people feel bad for ignoring you. It was building something so undeniably valuable that their oversight became their own loss, not yours. I'm not special, he concluded. I'm just someone who found a problem and solved it. Any of you could do the same. The question isn't whether you have the ability, it's whether you're willing to do the work even when nobody's watching. The applause was thunderous, but Daniel barely heard it. He was already thinking about his next project, the next problem to solve, the next thing to build. Because in the end, being invisible had taught him the most valuable lesson of all. Your worth isn't determined by who notices you. It's determined by what you create, who you help, and whether you can look in the mirror and respect the person looking back. 3 months later at graduation, Daniel Chen walked across the stage to accept his diploma. The applause was polite, enthusiastic even, but it didn't matter anymore.